Now, time for BBC Ask This. We've been asking you for your questions on Brexit throughout the day, and our reality check correspondent Chris Morris is here, along with Hannah White from the Institute for Government. And you are going to answer all these questions. And I've had a read of these, and this is going to be fascinating. So, Hannah, I'm going to kick straight away this question. Why is Mrs May asking for a delay until June when she has repeatedly said we would leave on the 29th of March, deal or no deal? That's from Irene Lindsay, who's in Sunderland, has emailed. I know it's a political question, but it's one that lots of people are asking.
So what the Prime Minister said is that she continues to believe that the right way for us to leave is with her deal. She hasn't been able to get her deal through yet. Parliament has said that it doesn't want us to leave with no deal, and unless we were going to actually revoke Article 50, the only alternative is to ask for an extension, and the Prime Minister's plan is to ask the Commons again to back her deal, and then to allow herself the time that we would need to put the implementing legislation in place, so that the legal side is all squared away before we actually leave.
And the bottom line is, I think she's made this promise about the 29th of March, I think 108 times with the dispatch box, but she's failed to deliver it. Given the makeup of Parliament, it's perhaps not surprising, because we've seen how utterly divided it is, as is the country. But she's made that promise many times, but we now know that she's going to be unable to achieve that.
Chris, Rod on Twitter, this could be John Bercow of Westminster asking this, why is it OK for May to keep trying a meaningful vote on her deal, but we, the public, cannot have more than one vote referendum? How is that democracy? Surely democracy is the right to change previous decisions by voting.
Which is kind of the other side of the first question, isn't it? And I suppose you can argue, well, votes in Parliament are slightly different than holding a referendum. But the principle that you vote once, no, that's not the right answer, vote again, it's a fair argument to make. Why is that OK in Parliament and it's not in the whole country? I suppose Parliament is a deliberative body of elected members that we have sent there to discuss these things, and minds are changed. But you can certainly make an argument. People will argue the other way as well, but you can certainly make an argument. If it's OK in Parliament, then it should be OK for the whole country as well.
Hannah, a lot of people say this is the EU approach. They will keep asking a question until they get the answer they want.
Yeah, I think the way our system is set up, like it or not, is that MPs are in charge. They had the opportunity last week to vote for a second referendum, had they wanted one, and they didn't agree to that. So, at the end of the day, our system is, if you don't like the way the MPs are making decisions, you vote them out at the next election. But that's obviously not something available to people at the moment.
At the moment. Right, let's move on. Question 3. Could the pro-Brexit Lords just filibuster anything and run the clock down? So the UK leaves with no deal. It's only 9 days to Brexit, and the UK government needs 12 months to bypass the Lords. That's according to the Parliament Act. Now, that's from P on Twitter. Hannah?
So it depends what you're talking about here. I think the thing that would be most potentially a problem would be if Theresa May wanted to pass the piece of secondary legislation which changed the date in UK law when we might leave. So she wants an extension. She has to pass a piece of secondary legislation in both the Commons and the Lords to change the date in our law. You might think that the Lords might be able to filibuster that, but actually there are a number of mechanisms in House of Lords procedure where, and you've got to remember here that the House of Lords is primarily a pro-European house, where if somebody was trying to take the debate on and on and on so that there wasn't time to pass the legislation, there were a number of mechanisms whereby they could be stopped from speaking so that that piece of legislation could be passed.
And on the meaningful vote, it's just important to remember it has to be approved in the House of Commons. All that has to happen in the House of Lords is a debate. There's no vote in the House of Lords on the meaningful vote, if that makes sense. No vote on the vote. The vote has to be in the Commons. The Lords just has to have a debate, and then it goes into the process of turning the withdrawal agreement into legislation. And
John Bercow was making the point yesterday that any vote on the extension needs to go through the House as well.
Yes, that's right. This is this piece of secondary legislation,
that's the secondary legislation,
which would have to be done once you get an approval of an extension from the European Union. Then you'd need to do that in the House of Commons and the House of Lords.
Right. Next question. This is on Twitter. This comes from Yasmina, and she says, legally, until what date do we have to be able to revoke Article 50 unilaterally?
So the question is here, the key thing is that as long as we continue to be a member of the EU and we're going through the Article 50 process, we can revoke.
At any moment.
So we could do it at the moment up to 11 o'clock on the 29th of March. If we get an extension and continue to be members during that period, we would still be able to revoke during that period. The thing that lawyers don't seem to agree on is the process for revocation, and whether Theresa May would be able to do that just using her prerogative powers, so just as Prime Minister to be able to do it, or whether, as with triggering Article 50, as was established in the court case that was brought by Gina Miller, whether you would have to pass legislation in order to do revocation.
Do we not know?
It's a matter of debate.
Much of this is a matter of debate. and just important to emphasise, we're talking about revoking here. In other words, removing Article 50 altogether. Brexit would not happen.
Yeah, staying as we are. Right. OK, now let's go to the next one. This is about the ERG, the European Research Group. If they abstain, would the deal go through? That's from Anon, who's been back in touch. Hannah, it's all about numbers.
It's all about numbers. So on the last meaningful vote, around 75 Conservative MPs did not, voted against. Of those, about 6 were sort of people's voters. If they were, even if all of those were to abstain, that wouldn't be enough to get the deal through, because the government lost by 153. So she actually needs people to actively come over and support the deal.
So this is where the DUP is important, and Labour votes are also going to be required.
You'd need a massive chunk of Labour votes in favour of a meaningful vote, even if all of the ERG abstained. And anyway, that's a bit of a moot point, because I think we're pretty certain that there is a hard core within the ERG, and the ERG is not a monolithic bloc, but there's a hardcore 20, 25, some people say more, who are going to vote against Theresa May's deal, come what may. Okay. They're not in abstaining mood.
Right. Hannah, an email from Joyce Jarman. If the final outcome is no deal, is further legislation on Brexit required, or is it immediate, as we have been led to believe?
So, as we have been led to believe, it is immediate. There's nothing that needs to be done in Parliament for us to leave with no deal. On the other hand...
There's always another hand.
Yes.
Having left, there were a number of pieces that the government has said we need to have in place so that our government has the power to do things which were previously done by the EU for us. So there are several pieces of primary legislation currently making their way through Parliament. There's a trade bill, there's an immigration bill, agriculture, fisheries, these sorts of things, and a whole lot of secondary legislation which is supposed to make our rule book make sense after we've left. And only about half of the secondary legislation has been passed, and then these other pieces of primary legislation we need so that we can do everything we need to do when we're no longer a member of the EU. OK,
I just want to move on to the next one. Chris, Mick Pusey has emailed, if a soft Brexit is the final outcome, what would the UK have to pay into the EU budget for access to the single market?
Yeah, so I got advance notice of this, so we looked at some of the numbers, because it is important, and the answer is actually quite a lot. So one of the comparisons people do is obviously with Norway, which is part of the single market. The House of Commons did some research on this, and using 2014 figures, it reckoned Norway paid into the EU budget about £115 per person in a year. The UK's net contribution to the EU budget that same year was 152. So a country that's not in the EU but still part in the single market will pay a substantial amount. So you'd still be talking about billions of pounds for the UK. There have been other estimates made saying it would certainly be lower than it is now, but not perhaps as low as some people might think. And of course, then you have to balance the payment you put in against the benefits that businesses and others get out.
Right. Now, the last question from Glenn on Twitter. Now, you and I talk many times between ourselves over a pint, although you still owe me. But we always... I always get a lot of questions about this. So, is it true, if we leave with a no deal legally for a period of 10 years, the EU has to allow us to import and export goods, etc., without any tariffs? Someone heard this on the radio. They heard it this morning. If it's true, leaving with no deal. Now, this is the GATT, this is the WTO, this is what every...
24 of
so many MPs come on the telly and say, this is the case. What is the truth?
It's not quite the case. It's much more complicated than that. The rules, they're essentially the rules of the World Trade Organization, but the GATT rules say that countries or trade blocs can come to an agreement with other countries or trade blocs to lower or remove tariffs. And they can also have an interim arrangement to do that until a permanent agreement is in place. And that's what this idea seems to be based on. But the question was, can we force the EU to do it. No, we can't, because you need to have an agreement in place in order to say we have an interim agreement. And the idea that you leave with no deal, well, then you have no agreement in place. Now, some people say, yeah, but we could just write a one-page agreement. And, you know, academics have said, well, here's a one-page agreement you could use. But you can't force the EU to do anything. You need two sides to have an agreement. It'd be quite a complicated agreement, potentially. And then you could look at applying this rule. But the idea that we can force the EU to ensure that there are no tariffs for 10 years, it's not the case. And
the 10-year thing is nonsense, is it?
There's another part of World Trade Organization rules which mentions a 10-year period. So 2 bits of information have been taken from separate places, and you talk to the Treasury, you talk to other parts of the government, they say they've taken 2 bits of information and given them far more significance than they have. It is a potential route which could be used in the future, but the idea that we could leave with no deal and then say to the EU, you have to do this for us, is simply not true.
Hannah nodding away there. I'm grateful to you both. Hannah White, Chris Morris, thank you both very much.